Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. This is a big day for us here on the show as we are introducing a different format than we've ever done before. So once I finish this little intro here, it's going to be Eric Helms doing the rest of the talking for this one, as we're going to be sharing some of his previously recorded monologues from the YouTube series titled Anecdotes and Observations. Some of you may recognize these lessons as the series first launched on the 3DMJ YouTube channel in January of 2018. But now we're going to be occasionally featuring them here on the podcast because, one, we think they're really great and useful. Two, we have a lot of podcast listeners who love this show but don't watch too much YouTube. And three, quite a few of you who did watch it on YouTube have also asked for the audio downloaded versions, the downloadable audio versions, I guess is what I should say. And we thought that sounded like a pretty great idea, so here we are. In the first few minutes of the recording, Eric does a great job introducing it, elaborating on the purpose of this series, why he created it, what the goal of these recordings was, and all that stuff. So I'll let him do that for each topic in a minute. But just so you know what you're getting into, the first mini episode will dive into progressive overload. The second episode is programming versus periodization. And the third will be about the limitations of anecdotes and why they can only carry so much weight within your athletic game plan. Each of those three monologues is about 15 minutes. And in between each of these chunks of Eric dropping knowledge bombs, you might hear my voice again, but it'll just be for a few seconds, reminding you of some cool stuff we have going on, and then you'll get right back to the man of the hour. So without further ado, let's get started. Here is our first ever episode, or audio episode, I guess, podcast episode of Anecdotes and Observations, featuring our Chief Science Officer and pop-locking dancing king, Dr. Eric Helms.
What's going on, everybody? Eric Helms here, back from a long hiatus from our channel. This series is called Anecdotes and Observations, also known as AYO, pronounced AYO. And as you know, I haven't been on the channel for a while. That is kind of a pattern I've had, is that I've made one series with a given focus per year. That's not been intentional. It's just that I feel like if I'm going to get on camera and talk about something, it needs to be of a very high quality, purposeful, unique, useful, and stand the test of time. And while I'd say I've been successful at that, I think it's also just not giving as much assistance to the community I'm trying to serve as I could. So I've been thinking about other ways to present information. So instead of doing the muscle and strength nutrition pyramid I did in 2013, or peeling back a layer like I did in 2014, or the muscle and strength training pyramid I did in 2015, or then, say what? Science and Application with Eric Helms I did in 2016, and then as opposed to doing nothing in 2017, this year, the plan is to give you something that I can do more frequently, have it be a little more free-flowing. I don't want to take too many takes. I don't want to do too much research. And it's called Anecdotes and Observations for a reason. And that's because while science is incredibly useful and we have high-quality data that can inform practice, science, as I've talked about before, very much is kind of the broad brushstrokes that we use, or how we initially start a protocol when we don't have a lot of individual data for a person. But how you change things over time, the observations you've seen with your athletes, your clients, and with yourself, and how you apply the principles that you get from training in the real world, that's very much always going to be kind of the realm of coach-based experience. And evidence-based practice we promote is a combination of three things, not just science. It's the scientific data, the personal preferences and needs of your client, and then the coach's experience. And they're seen as equal portions. And that's not to say that anecdote is just as good as science. It's just that they serve different purposes. For example, there's no meta-analysis to tell you what you should do on Thursday in the gym. It can tell you, do 10 or more sets per week to start getting optimal hypertrophy. If your goal is strength, you probably want to have some level of undulation in your rep ranges you train with, and you want to be specific, but that's just not the level of detail or the level of specificity to the individual that we need as coaches. So there's value in anecdotes and observations because they can help you make decisions. Even if you were to listen to me and listen to the perspective I gave or the theory of how to apply scientific knowledge, like what the series is, and you thought, oh, I would apply that slightly differently in this situation, that's really useful. Because listening to other coaches and other practitioners and other athletes talk about how they apply principles can open your mind and give you more options. It can give you more tools to use in your tool belt, as Jeff Alberts would say. So the goal with this series is to open it up with a general topic and me just to basically ramble at you about my thoughts, observations, and the way you might apply a certain principle or area of nutrition, exercise, or coaching science to the real world. So without further ado, we're going to kick off episode 1 of AEO with progressive overload. Okay? So progressive overload, very simply put, this is the way our body adapts to everything, right? And if we want to continue adapting to something to be better able to handle that stressor, it needs to be progressive. So it's not that our bodies are intelligent and they know when something is a stressor and they're going to adapt to it. More so, it's just that we're built, if you will, as these survival machines, meaning that we have a certain level of homeostasis, kind of the way we are resting internally with our current levels of adaptations to everything we deal with in life. All things are potentially disruptive to homeostasis. For example, if you've lived in a bubble your whole life, just the regular allergens in the air that don't even bother 90% of the population and the level of bacteria that's just in a regular home might kill that person immediately because they haven't adapted to it. Now, how that applies to exercise is that we need to impose an exercise stress that disrupts homeostasis enough for all the metabolic, hormonal, and structural milieu in our body to adapt so that we're better able to handle that stressor when we get it again, right? And that's just the way our species has evolved and survived and the way that biology works. It works within individuals and it works species-wide to make sure that I can live through the rest of my life if I keep encountering these same stresses and that I can pass on my DNA so that the species can survive, right? It's just natural selection, survival of the fittest. So, in an exercise setting, if we want to get stronger and get bigger, we need to impose stresses that result in our ability to handle them better. So that means a progressively larger load we have to lift to be able to lift progressively larger loads and get stronger. And we need to put enough stress on our muscles through progressive tension overload and potentially from other ways that modulate how much tension is put on our muscles and how much muscle is recruited, like metabolic stress, for example, to result in muscle growth and getting stronger. Now, knowing this principle, many, many well-intentioned and smart coaches, practitioners, scientists, and athletes have written programs with what's called a progression scheme, right? As an example, you might follow starting strength when you first start lifting, and you do squats on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and each time you squat, you're supposed to add an incremental microload to the bar, and that is thought or explained to be inducing progressive overload. If you squatted 155 pounds for 5 on Monday, you're going to try 160 on Wednesday, you're going to try 165 on Friday. And so long as you can add 5 pounds to the bar, awesome. And when you can't do that anymore, you need to go 2.5, right? Now here's the thing. A progression scheme and progressive overload are not the same thing, even though they're often presented that way. The act of adding weight to the bar is not inducing progressive overload in and of itself. The total stress that you induce on your body, that is what creates progressive overload. Now let me use an example to explain what the hell I mean, okay? Let's say that to get a reasonable amount of measurable progress from experience, or not even, you don't know this, but let's say this is just true. This is what is enough to disrupt homeostasis in you for you to get an adaptation. You need 10 sets per week on a specific movement at a relatively high RPE. And if you do that, you will see strength gains measurably over time, okay? Now, let's say you put yourself on a program that is 20 sets. Well, let's say 15 sets that are hard. That's probably not so much that it's going to push you into being so overreached that you can't see measurable progress. But let's say it's more than you need. It won't make you progress any faster. It's just excess volume, way past what you would need to optimally adapt, let's say that. So it's kind of like if this is the bell curve of as you increase volume, you progress, it's basically you need this much to optimally progress, and right here, that's how much volume you're doing before it starts to go down and start to slow down and then overreach, okay? So you're doing more volume than you need, but not so much volume that it would slow down your progress. You're doing these 15 sets, you only need 10 hard sets, and you're thinking that the actual act of taking those 15 sets and increasing load on the bar is creating progressive overload. Well, it's not. Even if you kept the load the same and you did 15 stressful sets for a couple weeks in a row and just kind of naturally let the RPEs go down as you got stronger, that's still progressive overload. You don't have to add weight to the bar because you're doing enough total work to induce progressive overload, right? So it's not the act of adding weight to the bar. On the flip side, you could be doing 6 sets or 5 sets, less than you would need to progress measurably. And you could try to add weight to the bar, but you wouldn't be able to because there wasn't enough total stress. So clearly we can see it's not the act of adding weight to the bar that is inducing progressive overload. That's only a very small part of it and creating a total tension overload stress on your muscles. But there has to be enough of that total stress to produce adaptation. And where that lies is going to change depending on your individual genetics, your training history, your training age, etc., right? And the goal of your training. So I think it's important to get this distinction that progressive overload causes adaptation, but progressive overload does not occur from simply attempting to follow a progression scheme. So what that means is that you can calm down a little bit if you don't match the targets that you set for yourself on a week-to-week or mesocycle-to-mesocycle basis. And you need to take a step back and kind of look at the big picture. And this is why it's very problematic when people go on and off diets frequently, or change programs frequently, or change exercises very frequently, or if they manipulate their variables too early based on kind of this fear response of not seeing that immediate progress. Because then you actually can't tell what is doing what. So this is especially important for bodybuilders, where the actual weight on the bar is only an indication that your muscles have gotten larger, not necessarily that is causing growth, right? Hypertrophy can aid strength. Getting stronger doesn't cause growth, right? It's kind of got a little bit backwards. So it's not like you're not growing if you can't add weight to the bar. It may be that you're just not giving yourself enough time, or that you're not eating enough, or that you're not sleeping well enough, or that you're changing your exercises too frequently to actually see those neurological gains coincide with those strength gains to hit a PR, right? Now, on the other hand, if you are a powerlifter, you do need to pay attention to the weight on the bar, and then the progression scheme becomes a little more important at a certain stage. But overall, we have to think that adaptation occurs when adequate stress prompts an adaptation, and adequate stress comes from the combination of volume and intensity. So the value in a progression scheme is not just the attempt to move more weight, but more in how it provides a balance between stress and recovery. So when someone writes a program, they're going to say, okay, we're going to go higher volume here, lower volume here, lowest volume here, and the load's going to go up. They're trying to balance the stress and the recovery that you will need at the right time to try to get an adaptation. And it may or may not work because there's a lot more going on that's going to stress you and cause recovery demand than what's just going on in the gym. So sometimes it just takes more time, sometimes it just takes more experience, but that's not to say that progression schemes aren't useful. For advanced lifters, a progression scheme can certainly help. If it's set up appropriately and you add small amounts incrementally, it's often a very useful thing because it's difficult to tell the difference between, on a given day, can I squat 495 or 500 pounds, right? For an advanced lifter, let's say an advanced power lifter, you may only be adding 5 to 15 pounds in a year. So you might have to write a program where you have an 8-week block of volume and then a 6-week block of intensity, a taper, and then a test for you to see a 5 to 10 pound increase on a lift. So you may indeed have to kind of pay attention to that, but you have to give yourself enough time. So it all depends on the context. So for advanced lifters, yes, the progression scheme is important and you need to set it up over an appropriate amount of time to actually see that progress. Additionally, a progression scheme can also be helpful when you or your lifter may be someone who is overly conservative in their load selection. So like if left to their own devices, they would either not increase the load because it still feels hard or hard-ish, or they had kind of a mental block against higher loads because they thought, oh man, last week or last month or this whole block, 400 pounds felt really heavy. I just don't think I can do more. Or maybe the rate that they would increase the load is a lot slower than what the progress they could be making. A good way to know if you're this type of person is if you're often surprised when you max test with how much more you got. This wouldn't describe you if you're the person who always misses in max testing because you're a little too overzealous and tries to take too much. But again, talking about if the goal is strength, if you're someone who is always pleasantly surprised in max testing and you're getting these 10, 20 kg or 20, 30 pound PRs on meet day or in max testing, you might be someone who's just kind of holding yourself back with the rate of strength progress you're making. And if that's the case, then yes, having a specific progression scheme with the planned amount that you add to the bar or a percentage increase based on a pre-test or relatively frequent testing at a given percentage as an AMRAP or something like that, those can all be useful strategies to make sure that you're not holding yourself back. But that's a specific situation. Many times what I run into is individuals who get too hung up on whether or not they can actually match the progression scheme. Now, sure, as a beginner, you should be able to see pretty obvious and quick increases in load, but they're almost going to happen without trying. You might have benched 135 pounds for 10, that first week in the gym, and then the next week you come in and you can just tell immediately during your warm-ups that 135 pounds is going to be too light. I'm going to be able to get 12 reps. You can just, it's not failure, or it's I could have done more weight. It becomes very obvious when you're gaining strength that quickly, and it is more so in that kind of early stage intermediate phase where people get hung up on this. They're still expecting to progress like a beginner, so they set their training up like a beginner, and then when they can't add weight to the bar, they think, I can't induce progressive overload. I'm not going to grow. Maybe you are. Maybe you've got enough total stress in your program where you are inducing progressive overload. You're just expecting it too early. So that's one possibility. But the take-home message here is, especially if you're in that early intermediate stage or mid-intermediate stage, don't stress it so much. If you're crushing yourself in the gym with a high-stress program and you're thinking this has to be enough for me to grow, but you can't see increases in load every time you're hoping to, it's likely that progressive overload is happening because it doesn't come from the act of adding weight to the bar. It comes from the act of giving yourself enough stress and being able to adapt to it or recover from it. So it's possible that you just aren't recovering enough. You've definitely probably, if you feel like you're crushing yourself and you're a powerlifter or a bodybuilder, we're not really, short in the hard work department typically. You probably are. It probably is enough. So the issue then is either it's a time frame. I'm not giving myself enough time to see the adaptation, or perhaps I'm not setting up my training in a way that I can recover from it, or things outside of the gym are negatively affecting my recovery. Perhaps I'm highly stressed, not getting enough sleep. I'm dieting or I'm not eating enough. All of those things could be playing a role. So I think the big take-home message here is remember that progressive overload happens from the overall stress you impose on your body relative to what you are currently adapted to, not from the act of just adding weight to the bar. And it can happen while you keep the load the same if you're doing enough volume. And it can also not happen while you're trying to add weight to the bar if there's not enough total work that you're doing. So again, there's a time and place for progression schemes, and they can be useful ways to check in and to encourage certain lifters. But overall, you want to take a step back, especially if you're not a beginner, and look at that trend. And then make sure that the other things outside of the gym are there. And then make sure you hold your variables constant. If you're constantly changing your nutrition, constantly changing your training, or if you get really inconsistent times you go to bed or sleep or all these things, that could be just throwing a wrench in your ability to actually gauge progress. All right, so that's all I got for you today. I hope that gave you some insight onto how much attention and weight you should give, no pun intended, to your progression scheme success or lack thereof, and understand how progressive overload works. I'll be checking out the comments, and I'll see you next month.
As of this month, we now have 29 free videos over at 3dmjvault.com. The Vault is our video-based online education platform, and it continues to grow every single month. There are instructional videos on posing, hypertrophy, fat loss, peak week, spine health, post-contest recovery, and a whole lot more. Again, you can check all of that out at 3dmjvault.com. Thanks so much for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of the show.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to episode 2 of Anecdotes and Observations. That's Ayo, pronounced Ayo! And today we're going to talk about periodization and programming. So I think often people don't know the distinction between the two, and it is sometimes just defined by the person talking about it. But I think probably the best way to think about periodization, it is indeed talking about periods of time. So it is talking more about your long-term goals, probably over a longer period of time, hence the word period, while programming has to do more with the day-to-day strategies within microcycle, within a week, or within maybe a block at most, like a mesocycle of 4 weeks, and within session. It's kind of setting up your split. Now, traditionally, bodybuilders have typically only thought about training within the week. They tell you which muscle groups they're training on which days, what rep ranges they're working in, and then largely they just try to work hard within that context, and they switch it up every, let's say, anywhere between 4 to 12 weeks, depending on the bodybuilder, the system they come from, how antsy in their pantsy they get when it comes time to switching movements, etc. While powerlifters typically have approach training with more planning in mind. They will do more higher volume, lower load, lower RPE, lower effort per set training farther away from competition, and they'll get more specific as they get closer to competition, using more assistance work further out, then doing more of their volume with the main lifts as they get closer, so they can build upon the weak points, build overall global hypertrophy to be stronger, to build their kind of capacity for strength, and then when they get close to competition, they drop the volume on everything else to be more specific so they can focus more energy onto their main lifts at a heavy load, similar to what they're going to do in competition, to drop fatigue and peak. And that largely makes sense. Now, as you've probably heard me say, or Alberto say, if you've been following 3DMJ, or Brad say for a long time, is that bodybuilders probably have something to learn from powerlifters. And while I think that is still true and that you want some level of organization, as we've had more and more data come out, especially a recent meta-analysis that found really no difference between periodization styles for hypertrophy, it's come to mind that perhaps that's not as black and white of a statement as it should be. And that maybe more of a focus on programming is all you need for hypertrophy, and periodization is something that is a little more important when you have a specific athletic goal like performance versus just global muscle mass development. Now, there's also another element of the definition of periodization which is worth talking about, which is that typically there's some kind of manipulation in the rep ranges you're working in and the volume and intensity over time. So for example, I'll give you some broad definitions. A linear periodized model just means that volume starts higher and then it goes lower as intensity goes up. That was kind of what I talked about with what powerlifters typically do. This can be done in kind of block periodization, where you do a volume block, an intensity block, then taper. Or it can be combined with other modes of periodization, like undulating periodization, where you might do, let's say, different repetitions on the same movement, different days of the week. So you might do like 8s on Monday, 6s on Wednesday, and then 4s on Friday when you're kind of further from competition. That becomes 5, 3, 1 when you're closer to competition. 5s on Mondays, 3s on Wednesdays, and singles on Friday. Just as an example. And that could be where you start with that undulation pattern and you end with that second undulation pattern. That would be a linear undulating program. It has elements of both. And certainly there is value in different periodization styles and formats for strength, and that's been relatively well established now in the last couple of years. I think in a recent meta-analysis that was published, and also an excellent article that was written by Greg Nuckols, where he basically did a kind of an open source article that was a meta-analysis on all the literature out there on periodization for strength. I'd definitely check out Stronger by Science if you want to read about that. And he found that indeed undulating models of periodization seem to be most effective, not hugely so, but more effective than non-periodized training and more effective than linear periodized training for trained lifters especially. So, and that definitely kind of goes hand in hand with what we see in the field with what powerlifters do. They're not just doing one repetition range for an entire 4 to 8 week period. Now, there's also a recent study that we covered in Mass where they compared the Hatfield system, which is a planned, thought-out system whereby you're training in 3 different repetition ranges within the same workout. So you're doing heavy, moderate, and then high rep based on the theory, which there is some empirical data on. In fact, there's an article that just came out by Brad Schoenfeld kind of hypothesizing with his co-authors that perhaps high rep, low load training might preferentially hypertrophy type 1 fibers, and perhaps vice versa, heavy load training or explosive training might better hypertrophy your fast twitch fibers. Now, this is definitely hypothetical. I'm not saying that is the case, but if it does indeed turn out to be that way, there is a rationale for doing various repetition zones for hypertrophy. And while we haven't really well investigated that, we do know that both high load and low load training, if it's to an appropriate effort level, so near to failure for high rep training, and probably if it's heavy enough, it doesn't need to be as close to failure. With heavy load training, both can stimulate hypertrophy if you match the number of sets. That's something we've seen repeated many, many, many times now. So we know that both high load and low load, and of course then moderate load training, are all effective for stimulating growth. But maybe, as we haven't really done many studies in this area, combining those different loading zones and repetition zones might be even better for hypertrophy. Then the question becomes, well, should we be doing it at the same time in different weeks and different days, in different blocks? This recent study that I was mentioning, the Hatfield system, has you do it in the same day. So you'll start heavy, go moderate, then go light for the same movement or same muscle group at the very least. And this was compared to a weekly undulating plan. And it found, so basically you do same different repetition zones in subsequent weeks rather than in the same session. And there wasn't a difference between the two. Now, this is interesting because this is one of the few times where they found that a non-periodized program, and I'll explain why the Hadfield system is technically non-periodized, seemed to perform just as well for hypertrophy as the periodized system. Now, what I mean by non-periodized is that even though this is a well set up plan, and it had targeted repetition ranges and specific rest periods and a lot of things that make sense, and it's very logical, and it's based on the hypothesis that various repetition loading zones combined would be best for hypertrophy. It didn't actually change over time. The goal was just to either add load or add reps when you could within the repetition range. And that's essentially non-periodized because there's not a change. There's no undulation, right? It happens all in the same workout, so it's not daily undulating, it's not weekly undulating, and there's no linearity to it. You're not seeing significant drops in volume as intensity goes up. They're kind of just both going up as you can progress. So essentially what they compared was a programming strategy, if you will, without any element of long-term periodization to a weekly undulating periodized program, and they didn't find a difference in hypertrophy. Now again, short-term study, we're not looking at long-time periods here, but also anecdotally, and this is kind of where we go back to that AO aspect of this video. There are tons of bodybuilders who follow plans that I think are well thought out and meet a lot of the guidelines we would call evidence-based in terms of frequency, volume, and intensity, but don't actually periodize their training. And I would say probably a few years ago, I would have thought that maybe that's not a good thing. But I'm less convinced of that now. And I think that perhaps as a bodybuilder, as someone who's purely focused on hypertrophy, it's maybe just not that complex. Maybe it just has a lot more to do with fatigue management, effort level, appropriate volume, appropriate frequency, and perhaps multiple different loading zones. So both heavy and light training and moderate training to make sure you hit every aspect of the muscle group. And then, of course, intelligent exercise selection. So what this means is that perhaps a programming strategy is more important for a bodybuilder, while periodization is something that you may only need to focus on if you're a strength athlete or, of course, any other type of athlete. So what might that look like? Well, it means you could set up a training program for hypertrophy that was largely based around empirical guidelines from the meta-analyses we have, which is a brief overview of them all. That means training each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week, doing at least 10 sets per muscle group per week, and then using perhaps a variety of loading zones. So probably training anywhere in the, I would say 4 to 20 rep range. And then making sure that you're training at an appropriate effort level. So I would say anything that's over 15, so let's say 12, anything in the 12 to 20 rep range, you want to be taking that to probably an 8 to 10 RPE, somewhere in there. Being smart about when you do that 10 RPE so that it's probably when you're finishing up a muscle group, So if you're going to do, say, overhead press and also lateral raises, you wouldn't want to be hitting 10 RPEs on the overhead press. It's going to make you get less volume on each subsequent set of overhead press, and then you're probably going to have to do lateral raises lighter. So maybe save that 10 RPE stuff for your last couple sets of lateral raises, as an example. And then, you don't have to go to failure, and you probably don't want to when you're in the moderate and moderately heavy repetition ranges. Right around 80 to 90% of 1RM, you're getting almost max motor unit recruitment from the word go, from the first rep. So let's say you're doing, your 8 rep max or lower. I'd say you can certainly use lower RPE ranges to kind of manage fatigue and allow yourself to get more volume. Because if you go to failure right from the get-go, it's going to tank a lot of the volume you can do for the rest of the session and affect following sessions. So I'd say probably in the, say, 6 to 9 RPE range for your heavy compound movements that are done in the 4 to 8 rep range, and then you can push it up to an 8 to 10 RPE as you do your isolation movements, your machine movements that are coming later in that session. So that's kind of the different loading zones, different RPEs, and then probably not a bad idea to just think about having like high volume, low volume, high stress, low stress days. So let's say you train each muscle group twice per week. You could have a harder day, an easier day, maybe a heavy day, and then a lighter day that's more volume. Space them out and just think about overlap of exercises. So long as you're training each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week, so long as you're training each muscle group with at least 10 plus sets, so long as you're thinking about training to failure so that it's not so much that it's actually impeding your recovery, and then just trying to progress in reps or load when possible. And then when you do stall, assessing whether it's an issue of fatigue management or just you need to actually induce more overload than the current volume level is providing. So that means, okay, do I need to change my deload schedule? Do I need to limit my RPEs? Do I need to just focus on my nutrition and my sleep? Or am I just expecting too much while I'm dieting? Those are all the fatigue management side of it. And on the other hand, well, I'm actually feeling fine. I'm just can't progress. And that's progressing in a reasonable time frame for your training age. So that means, if you're a novice bodybuilder, if you're not seeing progress, say, week to week, that might be an issue if you can't even add 1 rep, But if you're more intermediate, if you can't see it like, mesocycle to mesocycle, month to month, but if you're more advanced and you can't see, say, every 12 weeks some kind of addition of, improving your AMRAPs or something like that. If that's not happening, then perhaps if you are recovered, that's when it's time to actually add more volume. Go from, say, 12 sets per muscle group to 14 to see if you can do that, or just on the muscle groups where you're stalled. And that's a very valid way to train. That's technically not periodized, right? Because you aren't changing on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis what you're doing. You're just trying to add reps or add load when you can, and then you're just setting up your microcycle in a evidence-based manner within those guidelines. I think there's nothing wrong with that. So I think that's just a useful way to think about it, and it does relieve a little bit of that stress of having to understand the more complex aspects of training as an athlete. And it does explain why there's been so many successful bodybuilders who just primarily put in hard work with the solid basic template, and they do pretty well. Do I think there's never a time for periodization for bodybuilders? No. I think that's certainly not a bad idea, and with many of my more advanced lifters who are bodybuilders, I do take them through blocks of higher volume and then higher intensity. So they might be working in, say, the 8 to 15 rep range, and then the 4 to 10 rep range and for a 4-week block and a 4-week block, and then we'll test AMRAPs at like 90% of their pre-test estimated 1RM and see if they can improve their AMRAP at the end of that after a deload. So I think that's still pretty reasonable, but the basic template of what days they train what and what movements they do will roughly stay the same. I'll just change the RPEs and change the loading zones, if that makes sense. Now, for powerlifters, definitely you probably should have some element of periodization to what you're doing. As you get closer to a competition, you probably want to taper, and you probably want to be practicing like you're going to perform on the platform. You should probably have more squat, bench, and deadlift in your competition form, and they should probably be in the low repetition ranges and pretty heavy. You probably want to practice your openers a week out, and you want to get more specific as you get closer to actually performing that task. And I think there's many ways to skin that cat. But if you were to just follow a programming strategy where you were just always doing 5s or something like that. I think after you were a novice, you'd probably be leaving a little something on the table. You'd probably be progressing a little slower, and we actually have the empirical data to back that up. So this episode of AEO, I'm going to conclude by saying that hypertrophy, because it's not a specific skill of expressing strength on a specific movement for a specific 1 rep max, a lot of ways to get there. And so long as you set it up within the guidelines of what we think makes sense, like once again, 2 to 3 times per week per muscle group, and then 10 plus sets depending on your training age and what you can handle and where you've been previously, and then controlling RPE and having effective exercise selection that makes sense for your goals and your limitations. If there's any injuries or range of motion, all that stuff, check out the training muscle and strength training pyramid to get really specific guidelines there. Then I think that's probably the way to go. And the final caveat is that those are the averages from meta-analyses. Your mileage may vary. In fact, it's more than likely that it will, and especially as your training age increases. You may need to train each muscle group 4 times, or you may get better results. I shouldn't say need, because you'll probably grow on both, but you might get better results training each muscle group 4 times per week with 20 sets per week. Or you might be on the other end of the spectrum where you get a high growth response to training and a high fatigue response, and you decide to only train each muscle group 1.5 times per week with about 8 sets per body part. And that's like an example of that would be like, on the first one I described would probably be like a me or an Alberto Nunez. We found from trial and error that we do better with higher frequency, higher volume. And then Jeff Alberts on the other end of the spectrum has found that more kind of low to moderate volume with a low to moderate frequency he responds better to. So again, you're going to fall anywhere kind of in that spectrum of 1 or 2 standard deviations away from those averages, but that's a really good place to start. And then if you're a powerlifter, just make sure you get more specific as you get close to your competition. And that's pretty much it, folks. The difference between programming and periodization. Periodization includes programming and then changes it over time and follows some different types of templates. While programming can stay relatively static and you're just trying to induce progressive overload when you can, and then you just have to assess when you are stalled because of a recoverability issue. Fatigue management then becomes the goal, and potentially changing the way you train so that you can recover, or whether you simply need to add more volume to what you're doing. If you're already training with a high effort level, with a fixed volume, and you just simply cannot add reps or load, even though it's been, say, a couple weeks as a novice, or a month or 2 for an intermediate, or say 3 to 4 months for an advanced person. All right, folks, that's all I got for you. Thanks for tuning into AEO, and I will see you next time.
Real quick favor, guys. If you enjoy these shows and have been a listener for quite some time, we would really, 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 really appreciate it if you would take the time to give us a review on iTunes. Having lots of ratings and audience feedback makes our show become more visible across multiple platforms, which then supports our mission of helping as many people as possible to be the best athletes, coaches, and lifting enthusiasts they could possibly be. So if you're not driving and it wouldn't be super dangerous at the moment, pause this thing right now, give us an honest review on your podcast app, and we would love you even more than we already do. Thanks for taking the time. Hope you enjoy the show.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Anecdotes and Observation, Episode 3. That's AEO or AEO. My name is Eric Helms. Happy to be back. Today we're going to be talking about the inherent title of this series, The Limitations of Anecdotes and Observation. Now, obviously, I value anecdotes and observational knowledge, or I wouldn't have made this series. So the question is, why am I talking about the limitations? Well, to answer that, first we need to talk about scientific evidence and why that's often paraded around as the most important thing to use for knowledge in our evidence-based fitness community. So when I say evidence-based, what I basically mean is the concept that we should be using science to inform our decisions to some degree. Now, ideally, evidence-based practice is based on a model where you have three-pronged approach. You're using not only scientific research that you're engaging with to get the closest idea to the truth of what's best for training and nutrition, but also your clients or your own personal experiences, preferences, and individual differences. And all those things come together. So you have the three-pronged approach of your experience, the preferences and the individual differences of the client, and science that come together to make what we call quote-unquote evidence-based practice. Now, many people will make the mistake of just focusing on research. And because I call this a mistake because they don't understand the limitations of science. Now, this is a drum I've been beating for years, probably since 2011 or 12, but I've got to keep beating it because I continually see people making this mistake. So research, science-based evidence, is inherently flawed. And I wouldn't say flawed, but it's inherently limited in the fact that it is based on group-based research and reporting averages. And rarely does it give you individual differences, or does it tell you what is best for you to do. It tells what is best for a group within a given demographic. So you do a study, you sample from the same population, we'll say resistance-trained women from the age of 20 to 40, and you will then have them meet certain inclusion criteria for strength, how long they've been training, what menstrual cycle phase they're in, and whether or not they're using anabolic steroids, and then you'll give them this certain training intervention, cardio intervention, and they have to meet these food criteria, and then you see, I'm going to change one thing and what was better. Now, that's great, and that will tell you about, in general, what is better most of the time, especially if you find a statistically significant difference. And it will tell you the probability of what the likelihood that is, in fact, the case is. And then when you have multiple studies, maybe even a meta-analysis, you can be pretty damn sure that if they all find the same thing, that's probably generally true. Now, what you can't do with that is then go on Instagram, find a female natural pro bodybuilder who is not following that protocol, even though she fits that demographic, and say, hey, you're doing it wrong. Because you have no idea whether or not she might be one of those people who the group mean average change does not apply to. Because in every study I've ever seen done, there are people in either group who respond in the opposite direction or in a much different magnitude than what the group average was. Now, sometimes this is just simply due to them not following the criteria of the study, not actually meeting the inclusion or exclusion criteria, or some type of error in data collection. But just as often, it's because they're actually just different in either the biology, physiology, or their psychology, so that intervention is not the answer for them. It's not the best option, and they should be doing something else. So the misapplication of science is when you don't understand the limitations, that it's about the big picture, get in the ballpark, broad brushstrokes, not the fine detail work or the putting on the green. It's that long drive, right? It's trying to give you those big picture answers to get you in the ballpark of what's right. And then from there, the only data that matters is tracking your individual data systematically while paying attention and trying things multiple times over and over to see if you get the same effect, or taking that same systematic approach with your clients. So that needs to be said, even though this episode is actually talking about the limitations of anecdotes, because to understand the limitations of science are required before we talk about the limitations of anecdotes. Because once you've met the limits of what scientific knowledge can give you, you should be relying on anecdotes and experience. But then you have to know what are the limitations of anecdotes, experience, and observational knowledge. Now, we're probably well aware of some of those basic concepts because that's the whole reason why we focus on science. That's probably why you listen to me. You probably value science for some reason, and you know that certain anecdotal knowledge is not that helpful. For example, your average person out there who first gets engaged in bodybuilding will probably find the most jacked person or lean person or whatever person they want to look like or be like on Instagram and then copy what they do. And you'll see thousands of people getting decent results following this person's training program or nutrition program, and while that person seems to be getting great results. Now, if you argue with these people, most of the time they'll tell you, well, of course it makes sense to do it. I'm following insert name of world champion, Olympian, fitness model, etc. It's working great for them, and they're the best, so obviously that's the best program. But when you look at it like factually, you go, well, hold on, there's thousands of people getting poor gains and one person getting great gains in this program. This actually sounds like a really shitty program. But that's not the way anecdotes and observation and kind of group social norms work. People do illogical things, and that's why you go, you know what, damn it, I'm going to follow science, because that's not the way to go. And that's great. However, there is such a thing as useful anecdotes and useful observations, hence this series. Because if you're able to take systematic notes and, like I said, systematically track things while paying attention, you can get some very good data on individuals or groups of people, and you can make consistent changes that help people get to the highest level. Anecdotes and observations are actually how champions are made. Champions don't just look up the best meta-analytic data, follow it, and then win the world championship just because they have that in combination with genetics. Champions are made because they've paid attention to what works best for them, or they've had a coach help them do that, and they've trained hard for years. So observations and anecdotes are absolutely critical. However, they have limitations, and limitations that are a little more insidious than the ones I just talked about at the start. So for example, I'll use Team 3DMJ. We've been on the scene for almost 10 years now. We've been training as a group collectively probably a couple thousand clients. And if you listen to our podcast, if you read our blogs, if you listen to us talk on other people's podcasts, or if you have gone to one of our seminars, we use anecdote and experiential knowledge a lot because that's what coaches do. And it's the best thing to do when you reach the limits of science. However, as we become more and more popular, we've probably become more reinforced in believing that those anecdotes are indeed true. Now, why would that be? Well, as we become more popular, we're going to get more people self-selecting who want to work with us. So when we were an unknown quantity, people might hear about us and they would look us up and they go, sure, I'll try them. They have affordable prices. That guy looks jacked. Sure, I'll have him do my training or nutrition for a while. They have no preconceived notion of what we're going to do before they come in. Some people didn't even read our website. They just heard the good word, sent us an email, and we're off to the races. Now, fortunately, that was the foundation of how we developed our experiential knowledge, from people coming to us without a strong bias. But now in the year 2018, people come to us with a very specific idea in their head of what it's going to be like to work with us, why they want to work with us, and what it's probably going to be like. And the people who would think, you know what, I've tried that previously, that didn't work for me, or I really don't like their style, they're not going to work with us. They're going to work with someone else. So it's the people who've had some level of success, either in actual previous experience with our methods, or who believe in our methods who come to us that are either going to be self-selected to get success with us or get a nice placebo effect from working with us just because they think they're using the best methods possible, whether or not they actually are the best methods for that person. And what this creates is a reinforcement of our own beliefs and our own anecdotal experience. And we have to be aware of that. Now, it's not to say that our own anecdotal experience isn't true within the context of our clients. Indeed, it probably is. However, we have to be aware that when we're presenting information to the broad community, and when we're thinking about the way things work in a more general sense, that those anecdotal, observational, experiential knowledge cues that we've learned may not apply outside of our own community of athletes and followers. So that's one thing. So in addition to that, there's also limitations within groups. So for example, social groups create their own limitations. One example I will give you is bodybuilders. In bodybuilding culture, working extremely hard is seen as the badge of honor. I would even put it higher than having a great physique. If you're someone who consistently gets in the gym and gets in the kitchen and does your work, works very hard, pushes each set to the limit, and makes sure each day in the gym you've absolutely crushed it, you're going to get a lot of kudos. And you're going to be seen as someone who is part of the community. Your bros and sisters will give you that collective fist bump. Boom. You're part of the bodybuilder crew. And that's fine. I think there's value in that because to do what bodybuilders do requires a lot of hard work and a lot of effort. So it's no surprise to me that that's the main badge of honor. I'm part of that community, and that's where I trend to as well. And I would attribute a lot of my success to that, both in and outside of the world of bodybuilding. However, that does mean that there are certain elements of training that become basically non-options for changing. Now, why does this matter? Okay, well, here's something to point out. Probably the most common bodybuilding frequency of training is about one times per week per muscle group. You might train 4 to 6 days a week, but each muscle group is only hit directly once. Now, why would that be for over 30 years? Well, it's probably because bodybuilders have found that to actually be the best. And there was a recent study, I think done only a few years back, that found 2/3 of bodybuilders trained each muscle group once per week, and only 1/3 trained them twice per week, but no one trained it more frequently than that. Now, this is a bit in contrast with the research that would suggest a training frequency of 2 to 3 times per week is about where you maximize the training response on a per muscle basis. So this shouldn't be new to anyone following this channel, but the best data we have now is that if you're training each muscle group at least twice per week, regardless of how many times you step in the gym, so that could be full body, or upper lower, or whatever, that is typically where you get the most advantage out of increasing your frequency. But it's certainly better, and pretty clearly better, than just training each muscle group once per week. Now, why is it that 2/3 of bodybuilders don't do this? And they've actually observed the opposite. I've frequently seen bodybuilders talk about how they experience burnout, injury, or even a plateau in their progress when they try to increase their frequency beyond once per week. This goes back to our cultural beliefs as bodybuilders. If every session has to have the intensity and the volume cranked up to 11 or either or, typically if it's a low volume program, the intensity is super high and vice versa, then that limits the amount of frequency you can effectively do. To have a higher frequency approach be effective and maybe even be better than a 1 times per week frequency approach, you probably need to moderate how close you train to failure, and you probably need to reduce the volume per session. But most bodybuilders, when they go to a 2 times per week frequency, will keep the same volume per session and then just do another session within the same week, effectively doubling their volume. That's not how you're supposed to do it. If they don't want to drop their volume, they don't want to not train to failure, that's not an option for them. So of course, if you can't observe something, if you can't observe yourself following a higher frequency but lower intensity, lower volume per session approach, how could you know if a higher frequency would be better? So that's one example of how not everyone, but the bodybuilding community at large is relatively blind by their own anecdotes. Yes, 30 years of bodybuilding experience would tell us that all champions tend to use a 1 times per week frequency, or somewhere no more frequently than every 4th or 5th day. But that's because they're unwilling to change certain variables that would probably be necessarily changed if they went to a higher frequency. Now, this episode isn't about frequency. It isn't about science. It is about the limitations of anecdotes and observation. And I bring them up for a specific reason. 1, if you know the limitations of science, fantastic, then you're not going to be that PubMed ninja who's pissing everybody off and not really being helpful in any way. And you can move on and actually start using good quality anecdotes and observation to inform your training or your client's training once you've reached the limitations of science. Likewise, if you know the limitations of anecdotes, you can become more aware and not make errors in your decision making because you don't actually have high quality anecdotes. You don't want to be a victim to the limitations of either. So if you know the limitations, then you can do a little more self-checking, and you can assess, is this anecdote actually true in all contexts, or what context is it true in, and what do I actually not know? Because that's where there's room for advancement and learning, and potentially new avenues of growth and progress. So be aware of the limitations of both science and anecdotes. Make sure you self-check, and you will get new levels of knowledge and hopefully new levels of gains. And I will see you next time on AO! Hey everybody, it's Eric Helms. Thanks for tuning into our podcast. As you know, at 3DMJ we promote evidence-based approaches to the lifting community. If that's something you want to dive deeper into, I'd encourage you to check out my research review, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, or for short, MASS. This is a review that myself, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Greg Knuckles put out every month. We cover the latest research publications that are applicable to strength and physique athletes, or anyone who's looking to get stronger or improve their body comp. Our content is in both written and video format. For more information on how to subscribe, check out 3dmusclejourney.com/mass. That's 3dmusclejourney.com/MASS for further details. Thanks for tuning in.